Beneath the stone hearths of forgotten kitchens, behind the tapestries of old manors and the crumbling ruins of roadside inns, there lingers a silence that once crackled with fire, salt, and smoke. In the flicker of torchlight, medieval cooks labored not merely to feed, but to preserve life itself. Long before refrigeration, long before industrial canning lines and vacuum-sealed packaging, these unsung artisans developed preservation methods so precise, so sophisticated, that some modern scientists are still working to understand how they worked, let alone how they were discovered. The history we're taught often draws a clean line through time, suggesting that the ancients fumbled in darkness until the Enlightenment brought clarity. But as we peel back the layers of culinary history, we find that this narrative is flawed, dangerously so. For in the medieval world, cooks weren't simply preparing meals. They were preserving the future, guided by inherited knowledge that had no modern named in monasteries, apothecaries, and the hidden vaults of aristocratic estates. The art of food preservation was refined into something resembling a science. 1. Informed by astronomy, alchemy, herbology, and even sacred geometry. Salt and smoke were only the beginning. These cooks experimented with drying techniques in climate-controlled pantries lined with porous limestone, which absorbed excess humidity. Like a living filter, they packed meat in honey not just for sweetness, but for honey's antimicrobial properties, a natural preservative so powerful that jars of it have been found unspoiled in ancient Egyptian tombs. But the medieval applications were uniquely advanced. Honey was infused with myrrh, resin, or even vinegar, creating acidic environments that preserved texture and color as well as edibility that in certain abbeys across Europe, particularly in regions of southern France, northern Italy, and the high tatras of what is now Slovakia. Records hint at a peculiar method of preservation that has since vanished from mainstream practice. These monks buried food items, tightly wrapped in wool soaked in beeswax and herbs, within deep clay jars sealed with resin, then placed them in subterranean vaults whose temperature and humidity were meticulously monitored through handcrafted instruments of brass and bone. This system maintained consistent environmental conditions for months, even years. Some believe this wasn't mere coincidence. It was a technology passed down in secrecy, designed to maintain biospheric balance. But who taught it to them? The church would have you believe it was divine inspiration. Yet among certain cryptic manuscripts, the Liber de Coquina, the Tequinum Sanitatis, and the lesser-known Manuscriptum Siculorum, are illustrations and marginalia that defy that explanation. Sketches of preservation chambers designed like ancient tombs. Recipes that require ingredients not native to medieval Europe, including spices only recently discovered during the Crusades. Instructions for fermenting not just cabbage or milk, but flesh, using a brine that includes iron shavings and instructions to stir only under the waning moon. Such elements hint at a deeper layer of culinary mysticism. Could these techniques have descended from older knowledge, older even than Rome or Egypt? There are those who believe that beneath the layers of medieval society, beneath the layers of time itself, lies an ancient intelligence. Not artificial, in the mechanical sense, but natural, a kind of living algorithm encoded in the rhythms of the earth. Some claim that select medieval guilds were custodians of this code. Consider the Butchers' Guild of Bruges. More than mere meat sellers, this guild owned entire stretches of refrigerated canals. They lined these waterways with dense groves of alder trees, known for their antifungal bark. According to records, the meat they transported would stay fresh for days without ice. But here's the catch. The methods were never publicly documented, and when the guild dissolved, the knowledge vanished. All that remains are coded symbols etched into the walls of the old guild hall. Symbols resembling Babylonian cuneiform merged with Norse runes. Some of them, eerily, appear again in the Voynich manuscript, a book no one has ever definitively decoded. And what of the salt roads? These winding trade routes not only moved salt across Europe, but ideas, recipes, techniques, tools, many of which have been lost to war, plague, and the slow erosion of memory. In the alpine town of Hallstatt, archaeologists discovered a mine with remarkably preserved organic materials, leather, wood, even ancient cured meats. The salt there had naturally mummified them. But more curious was the structure of the mine, spiral shafts aligned with solar angles, not unlike the Great Pyramids of Giza. Coincidence? Or a shared inheritance of forgotten engineering principles, tied to preservation of matter itself? There's also the matter of fermented foods, sauerkraut, mead, pickled fish, each a microcosm of living organisms sustaining the viability of nutrients across months, even years. Medieval cooks understood this at a gut level. Quite literally, they believed that the health of the gut determined the health of the soul. Recipes were designed to cleanse, to stabilize mood, even to enhance spiritual visions. Some convents practiced ritual fasting punctuated by specific fermented dishes, believing these foods made them more receptive to divine knowledge. What modern science now calls psychobiotics, probiotics that influence mental health, was once the purview of cloistered women in walled gardens, tending vinegar vats as though they were sacred fires. But here lies the deeper mystery. Why were so many of these techniques buried, forgotten, omitted, rewritten in vague Latin, or destroyed outright during inquisitions and reformations? Some say it was simply the erosion of oral tradition. Others claim something darker, that these techniques were systematically erased because they pointed to a deeper truth, that medieval society, when seen not through the lens of filth and darkness, but through the forgotten practices of its most obscure artisans, was closer to mastering environmental sustainability than we are today. Take, for example, the root cellar. More than a cold storage space, in many regions it was designed as a harmonically resonant chamber, often aligned to ley lines or planetary configurations. These spaces weren't just about preservation, they were about transformation. Foods placed in such cellars were believed to undergo a kind of maturation not dissimilar to alchemical processes. A few 15th century texts even suggest that specific chants, intoned during storage, could delay spoilage. Folklore? Perhaps. But modern studies on sound frequencies affecting microbial activity suggest there may have been something more at work. In the Baltic regions, clay pots used for food preservation were often inscribed with patterns that match fractal equations, patterns only rediscovered in the 20th century through chaos theory. These motifs weren't decorative. They were functional, meant to vibrate at particular frequencies during temperature shifts, maintaining a balanced microclimate inside the vessel. And who taught them this? There are whispers of an earlier civilization, pre-Saxon, pre-Roman, that developed resonant ceramics. One unearthed pot, discovered in a peat bog in Estonia, emitted a low hum when struck. A hum tuned to 432 hertz, the so-called frequency of the universe. And then there are the forbidden texts. The Sanguis Codex, suppressed by the Church in 1237, and rumored to reside now in a private Swiss archive, contains pages describing a process of preservation through magnetism. It posits that certain cuts of meat, when exposed to naturally magnetized stones and buried under birch for exactly 72 nights, become stilled in time. The implication isn't just preservation, it's stasis, a pause in biological decay. The implications are staggering and terrifying. All of this points to a singular conclusion. Food preservation in the medieval world was not a primitive guesswork of salt and desperation. It was a complex, multi-sensory science, one encoded with knowledge now labeled mystical, esoteric, or mythological. And perhaps that is why it had to be forgotten. Because to remember it would force us to rethink not just how we eat, but how we live. The silence deepens when we realize what was truly lost. In the dim spaces beneath medieval towns, where forgotten staircases spiral into crypts, where mold thickens on ancient beams, where dust blankets the bones of what once was, lie fragments of a civilization that may have understood time differently, not as a forward march, but as a cycle. Preservation, after all, is not only about keeping things from decay. It is about resisting the clock, outwitting entropy, And perhaps medieval cooks were doing exactly that to eye in the tangled forests of Bohemia. Oral legends tell of forest dwellers, herb women, and root men, who preserved not just food, but memory. They stored fruits in carved stone basins, coated in layers of crushed pine resin and stinging nettle ash. These mixtures, when examined centuries later, contain antimicrobial properties that rival some modern preservatives. More curiously, the fruits, blackberries, apples, elderberries, were arranged in spirals, their positions based on lunar cycles. The implication is chilling. The food was being preserved not merely by material means, but by time itself, aligned with its ebb and flow. And yet, none of this knowledge was ever standardized. Why? Because much of it was meant to be hidden, passed down not through textbooks, but through ritual. It was layered in the fabric of guild oaths, etched into the wood of kitchen doors, embroidered into the hems of aprons. A master cook wasn't merely trained. They were initiated to eye in the city of Bologna. A guild of women known as the Conservi Domini was tasked with maintaining preservation practices for generations. Their kitchens were silent sanctuaries, where every jar and flask had a lineage, every herb a timing. Recipes were sung in dead dialects. Jars were sealed with waxes dyed specific colors, denoting not contents, but intended future use. Yellow for endurance, red for healing, black for memory. Some of these jars, discovered unopened in a hidden chamber beneath the old city hall, still contain intact preserved walnuts and gooseberries. Chemical analysis revealed no modern preservative agents, and yet they endure. Point one cannot help but ask, was this simply trial and error perfection? Or had they stumbled upon principles we've since ignored? The line between food and alchemy was always thin. In 13th century Toledo, where Islamic, Jewish, and Christian scholars mingled in uneasy peace, manuscripts emerged describing a method of preserving dairy using powdered marble and aged lime, stored beneath brass domes etched with Kabbalistic sigils. Some of these domes were discovered in 1886 beneath the collapsed ruins of a Sephardic kitchen. Within them, soft cheese, unspoiled. The sigils? They match astronomical alignments now known to influence gravitational fields. The implication? These cooks may have understood food as a cosmic material, subject to celestial rhythms as much as chemical ones, that it's not fantasy. It's a glimpse of something buried, something we have dismissed too quickly. Look to Iceland, where hakarl, fermented shark, has been consumed for centuries. The process involves burying the meat in gravel-lined pits for months, allowing it to undergo controlled rot. It's a harsh method, but precise. The meat becomes safe only at the right moment. Too soon, it's poisonous. Too late, it's unusable. But the Icelandic sagas whisper that the original method involved stone rings, placed around the meat in patterns meant to bind the spirit of the rot. It sounds absurd, until you realize the ring patterns match prehistoric stone circles found across Europe. Could it be that these weren't just ritual sites? Could they have once functioned as bioenergetic fields, literal zones where time and biology shifted? There is no conclusive proof, but the resonance is undeniable, and then we return, inevitably, to the monasteries, particularly Mont Saint-Michel, where tides conceal and reveal its silhouette like a ghost. Within its walls, food preservation was not a task. It was a form of devotion. Monks treated the act of storing food as a covenant with time itself. In hidden alcoves, they inscribed symbols, some Christian, others more arcane. One, etched behind a now-sealed door, resembles the Egyptian ankh fused with a Celtic triquetra, a sign of life extended, braided through past, present, and future. In one surviving scroll, a monk describes sealing dried fish within a leather bag lined with juniper ash, then placing it within a vault whose stone walls were embedded with copper and quartz. These stones, he notes, sing at dawn when touched by sun. He believed this subtle vibration, barely perceptible to the ear, helped stave off decay. Science now knows that quartz under stress emits a piezoelectric current. Could medieval minds have intuitively harnessed this phenomenon? It would not be the first time they did so without understanding the physics. Ancient grain silos in Transylvania were discovered to have floors lined with magnetite. Their purpose? Unknown. But grain stored there resisted fungal infections far longer than grain stored elsewhere. This wasn't chance. It was pattern. It was intention. Across the channel, in a village now swallowed by ivy and mud, Warren Percy, archaeologists uncovered a series of ceramic urns buried near kitchens, filled with what appeared to be rotting grain. But further analysis revealed these grains had been inoculated with a specific strain of mold, which in turn secreted a protective enzyme. This may have been a deliberate fermentation, not for consumption, but for soil enrichment. A primitive, biotechnological cycle, food preserved, then transformed, then reborn. Was this simply agriculture? Or was it something more, a closed-loop preservation of life force itself? There are whispers of entire texts burned for even suggesting such ideas. The Tabula Saporum, translated as the Table of Flavors, was said to contain preservation instructions for meats kept edible for decades. It reportedly described storage in glass orbs, sealed with waxes mixed with powdered sapphire and suspended in flowing water. Whether these were real or symbolic, we may never know. The last known copy vanished from the private library of Cardinal Ranuzzi in 1711, but fragments remain in side notes, in forgotten cookbooks, in the margins of tax ledgers. One such margin, written in Middle Dutch in a 14th century spice register, simply reads, "Preserve not with the hand, but with the circle." What was the circle? The moon? A sacred geometry? A symbol of eternity? Perhaps all three. The more we examine, the clearer it becomes. Preservation was never just chemistry. It was a worldview, a lens through which time, death, and decay could be softened, if not avoided, then at least postponed. Cooks weren't just servants. They were gatekeepers to this alchemy. They operated in secrecy not out of superstition, but because power, once tasted, must be hidden. Consider this. In 1322, a French nobleman known only as Le Vicomte de Mireille held a banquet during the dead of winter featuring fruits harvested the previous spring, pears, plums, and berries, as fresh as the day they were picked. Guests called it sorcery. The Vicomte said nothing. But months later, his manor was burned, and his name struck from local records. All that survived were two sealed jars, discovered centuries later, containing not fruit, but layers of wax, ash, and myrtle leaves. Some believe he tapped into a system now lost. A system where food, once preserved, became a kind of artifact, something neither alive nor dead. A vessel for time. And so the question haunts us. How much have we forgotten, not by accident, but by design? In every sealed cellar, every ruined abbey, every forgotten cookbook eaten by damp and flame, we lose more than recipes. We lose an understanding of time, of balance, of harmony with nature's decay. What remains are echoes, copper rings, hums in stone, forgotten symbols on glass. Clues, scattered like breadcrumbs through the forest of history, leading us toward a truth too radical to survive the rise of industrial modernity. That food, once prepared and preserved with reverence, could become something more. A defiance of mortality, a memory kept alive. And in that memory, we find not just a lost science, but a forgotten philosophy. That life, preserved with intention, is sacred. That decay, managed with wisdom, is not the end, but the beginning of transformation. And that buried beneath centuries of silence is a recipe, not just for survival, but for something more eternal. The final remnants of this forgotten legacy lie not in the illuminated texts or royal kitchens, but in the quietest places, where moss overtakes stone and the only witness is the wind. Peasant homes, collapsed cellars, forest clearings where ancient ovens now lie in ruins. We have looked to the cathedrals for grandeur, to the castles for power, but the true alchemists were often barefoot, stirring pots over embers, working not for wealth or prestige, but for the quiet triumph of preservation. In the medieval worldview, food wasn't just sustenance. It was a vessel for memory, a bridge between the seen and unseen. The act of preserving food, whether through fermentation, burial, salting, or infusion, was also a form of storytelling, a way to pass on not just nourishment, but wisdom. The remote Carpathian region, a discovery in the mid-20th century, left researchers baffled, a sealed wooden box buried beneath what was once a kitchen floor. Inside, small wax tablets, each with etched diagrams showing preservation layouts for underground storage. But what struck archaeologists most was the shape of the designs. They formed a mandala, a symmetrical diagram with repeating concentric circles, each labeled with food types, seasons, and planetary symbols. One ring was dedicated solely to foods for sorrow, another for dreams. This wasn't mere storage. It was intention made manifest, a cosmological kitchen where food was attuned to emotion, ritual, and time. It suggests a worldview we've forgotten. That what we eat is not separate from what we feel, what we remember, or what we become. But the deliberate erasure of this knowledge was not just cultural, it was political. When Europe entered the age of colonial expansion and industrial revolution, the value of slow, intentional preservation was replaced with shelf-stable products, mass canning, and centralized food distribution. Knowledge once passed through apprenticeships, and generations became obsolete overnight. The knowledge wasn't merely abandoned. It was overwritten. Take the curious case of the Folio Mortuorum, a manuscript from 1479 believed to contain among its pages the dietary preservation practices of an obscure sect of Flemish monks. The text, written in a strange fusion of Latin, Old Dutch, and ciphered symbols, was confiscated by Spanish inquisitors and marked as heretical. Its contents were never published, but a single surviving excerpt, now housed in a university archive in Leuven, reads, "The world rots where the memory is not salted." It's a haunting metaphor, but also literal. These monks may have believed that preserving food was a divine act of resistance against the decay of both flesh and history. That to salt the body was to salt the mind, to anchor memory against the dissolution of time. Today, science can isolate every bacterium, measure every pH level, replicate every fermentation process in sterile labs. But what it cannot replicate is intent. Medieval preservation was done with care, intuition, reverence. It was a living conversation with nature, an agreement not to conquer decay, but to understand it. In the damp corners of old kitchens, one sometimes finds a strange relic, clay vessels sealed so tightly that their contents remain untouched. In one such vessel, discovered in an abandoned priory in Devonshire, was a single preserved plum, darkened by centuries, but intact. Under the right light, its skin still shimmered. It had outlived generations. Why does that matter? Because in that plum is a question we can no longer ignore. What else have we preserved by accident that we have forgotten on purpose? Beneath the layers of soot and moss, under the torn pages and burned libraries, there is still a heartbeat, a rhythm, a chance to remember not just how they preserved food, but in every buried cellar, in every sealed jar. There is a whisper that life can be prolonged not just by science, but by listening. That food is not just what we consume, but what we carry forward. And that somewhere, in the quiet work of those nameless cooks, a deeper truth survived. If only we are willing to uncover it. The next time you seal a jar, ferment a vegetable, or dry herbs for winter, remember, you are not simply preserving food. You are preserving a memory, a defiance, a philosophy. One jar at a time. If this journey into forgotten kitchens and forbidden knowledge stirred something in you, if you felt the weight of history, the chill of mystery, or the resonance of lost truth, then subscribe for more immersive stories like this. Like the video if it made you think differently about the past, and comment below with your theories. What else might medieval cooks have known that we've only just begun to rediscover? There is still more to uncover, and history is hungrier than we think.